At 2:52 in the morning, a CCTV camera in Swindon Town Centre captured Shauna Callahan walking alone. She looked calm. Nothing about her suggested danger. Minutes later, she stepped into a taxi. She was never seen alive again. That taxi, that single, unremarkable decision, would trigger one of the most intense missing persons investigations in Wiltshire's history. It would expose a predator who had been operating in plain sight for years. It would uncover a second victim, buried in a field 80 miles away, hidden for nearly a decade. And it would force a detective to make a choice that destroyed his career and that Britain has never fully resolved. But here is the detail that changes everything. The man behind the wheel had done this before. No one knew. Shauna Callahan was 22 years old, and her life was exactly where it was supposed to be. She had grown up in Swindon, a large working town in the west of England, the kind of place you know in your bones when you've spent your whole life in it. She was embedded there. She belonged to it. Those who knew her described someone warm, direct, and quick to laugh. Not someone who sought attention, someone who drew it without trying. Her friends talk about her energy. Her family talk about her heart. By March 2011, she was working as a personal assistant. She had a serious boyfriend, Kevin Reap. She had close friends. She had a future that stretched ahead of her, full of ordinary and extraordinary things. Nothing about her life put her at risk. Nothing about that Friday evening suggested danger. The danger wasn't in her choices. It wasn't in her circumstances. It was behind the wheel of a licensed taxi, waiting for her. Friday the 18th of March, 2011, bled into the early hours of Saturday. Sian and her friends had spent the evening at Suju, a popular nightclub in Swindon Town Centre. A normal night. Good music, familiar faces, the easy warmth of people who know each other well. By every account, she was fine, relaxed, just a young woman on a night out. But as the hours passed midnight, the group began to thin. People drifting home, the natural scatter of any late evening. By approximately 2:50 in the morning, Sian left Suju alone. At 2:52 a.m., a CCTV camera caught her in the town center, walking, calm, heading toward Wood Street, where taxis idle, where the journey home begins. That footage would later become the most critical 30 seconds in the entire investigation. Because after that moment, the cameras lost her. Somewhere between that frame and her front door, Shauna Callahan stepped into a taxi. It should have been the most routine decision of her night. The kind you make without thinking. Hand out, car pulls over, you give your address, you go home. She had done it before. Millions of people do it every weekend across Britain. But this taxi was different. This driver was different. And nobody would understand how different until it was far too late. When Kevin Reap woke that Saturday morning to silence, when the calls went unanswered, when the hours accumulated, he knew. In the way that people who love someone always know. He knew. He reported Sian missing to Wiltshire police. And somewhere in Swindon, the man who had been driving that taxi was already starting another shift. The first instinct is always to hope for the simple explanation. Phone died. Stayed with a friend. Some mundane reason nobody's thought of yet. Kevin Reap tried to hold on to that. But the silence from Sian's phone wasn't the silence of a flat battery. And he knew it. Wiltshire police launched a major missing persons investigation. Senior investigating officer, Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher, experienced, driven, and from the very first hour, treating this with maximum urgency. Because that was the calculation that ran beneath everything. If Sian had been taken, if she was being held somewhere, every hour without an answer was an hour she might not have. The difference between alive and dead can be measured in minutes. Fulcher understood that. His team understood that. Sian's photograph went out across local and national media. Her parents, Mick and Elena Callahan, made public appeals, their faces carrying the specific, terrible tension of people who have not yet been allowed to grieve. Kevin Reap stood in front of cameras, visibly falling apart. The community responded. Tips came in, but Sian wasn't found. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, and with every hour that passed, the chances of finding her alive was slipping. And the whole time, through every appeal, every search, every camera that caught Swindon looking for her, one question kept returning to the investigation. Who was driving that taxi? That was the question everything eventually reduced to. Not just the CCTV, not just the timeline. The taxi, the driver, the journey she took that nobody had been able to trace. Somewhere out there, that driver was still in Swindon, and investigators were about to find him. Taxi firms operating in Swindon that night were identified and contacted. Drivers were traced. Timelines cross-referenced against the CCTV window. They weren't looking for a suspect yet. They were looking for a route. And then they found something that didn't fit. GPS data. Many taxis in England in 2011 were fitted with satellite navigation devices. Devices that log where a vehicle had actually been. Not where it was supposed to go, where it went. Time-stamped, mapped, recorded. When investigators pulled that data, they found something that didn't fit. One car didn't come back. Not to Swindon. Not to any logical destination for a town centre fair. A driver named Christopher Halliwell, 4 to 7 years old. Licensed. No significant criminal record. To anyone who looked at him on paper, unremarkable. A middle-aged man, a taxi, a town. But his GPS told a completely different story. In the early hours of the 19th, the exact time frame in which Sian had vanished from Wood Street, Halliwell's taxi had traveled far outside Swindon. Deep into rural Oxfordshire, miles from any fair that made sense. This wasn't just a strange journey. It was a break in the entire case. And here's the thing that makes it worse. The thing that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. At the point investigators were looking at Halliwell's GPS data, at the point his taxi was being flagged, his movement scrutinized, he had already killed before. There was already another woman. Already another grave. Already another family that had been waiting for years with no answer. Nobody knew that yet. But everything still came back to one question. Who was driving that taxi? They were about to find out. Christopher Halliwell was located at a retail park in Swindon on the 24th of March, 2011. 5 days after Sian had stepped into his car, he was placed under arrest on suspicion of abduction. Then Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher made a decision that would cost him everything. He didn't take Halliwell to the police station. Instead, he drove him to Barberry Castle, an ancient hill fort on the open Wiltshire Downs. No interview room, no recordings, no solicitors, just 2 men and a question. Where is she? There was just one problem with what Fulcher was about to do. It broke the rules. Under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, an arrested person must reach a police station, must be offered legal advice before any questioning begins. These aren't technicalities. They are protections built after decades of documented police misconduct, of innocent people pressured into false confessions. They exist for good reason. Fulcher knew this. He bypassed it anyway. His reasoning: he didn't know if Sian was still alive. He believed that the moment a solicitor entered the room, Halliwell would say nothing. And if Halliwell said nothing, and Sian was somewhere waiting, then she would die while procedure was followed. Procedure versus life. He chose, and there was no way to undo that choice. On that Wiltshire hillside, he asked Christopher Halliwell where Sian was. And what Halliwell said next changed the entire case. Not just because of what he revealed about Sian, but because of what he said after that. Halliwell led officers to a location near Uffington, in Oxfordshire. Ancient chalk country, the Vale of the White Horse. Fields that have been there for thousands of years. They arrived. Officers spread out across the ground. For a moment, nothing. Then one officer stopped moving and called the others over. They found Sian Callahan, 22 years old, murdered, stabbed, left in that field while her family drove roads and held press conferences and willed their phones to ring. She had been there the whole time. The grief that arrived in that moment. For Mick and Elena Callahan, for Kevin Reap, for everyone who had refused to stop hoping, is not something that fits inside language. It can only be placed here and left to stand. But Halliwell hadn't finished talking. There was another victim. Her name was Rebecca Godden Edwards. Becky Godden. She had been reported missing around 2003. She was in her early 20s. She had struggled with addiction and lived at the margins. The kind of margins that, as this case would later make brutally clear, sometimes lead institutions to look away. Her disappearance had been logged, not urgently pursued. Halliwell knew exactly where she was. He had always known. He led officers to a field near Eastleach, Gloucestershire, 80 miles and 8 years from the moment her mother, Karen Edwards, had first started making calls that went unanswered. Becky's remains were in that field. 2 women, 2 graves in the English countryside. One man who had driven a licensed taxi through the same county as though none of it had ever happened. And then, at the precise moment when justice seemed within reach, the law delivered a blow that almost made everything worse. Because of how those disclosures had been obtained outside pace, without legal protection, away from a police station, the evidence was compromised. For Sian's case, the forensic and GPS evidence was strong enough to stand independently. Halliwell pleaded guilty to her murder at Bristol Crown Court in October 2012. He received a life sentence, with a minimum of 25 years. Justice, in the formal sense, was served. But for Becky Godden, whose body had been found because of that same hillside conversation, the path to a murder prosecution was suddenly, sickeningly narrow. The confession that should have anchored the case could not be used the same way. Becky had waited 8 years to be found. She would have to wait 5 more years for justice. 3 separate threads, each painful in its own way. For Sian's family, October 2012 brought formal conclusion. A guilty plea, a life sentence, the courtroom door closing on the worst chapter of their lives. Not healing, there's no such thing, but acknowledgement. A legal statement that what was done to their daughter was unacceptable and would not go unpunished. For Karen Edwards, the road was longer and harder. 8 years of not knowing. 8 years of phone calls and dead ends. And then, the answer she had sought, and the justice that was still out of reach. She became a public advocate, fierce, persistent, wholly unwilling to be politely absorbed by official process. She named what others danced around, that her daughter's disappearance had not been treated with the urgency it deserved. That vulnerable women struggling with addiction, women living at society's edges, are not afforded the same response as others when they go missing. That this is not coincidence. It is a pattern, and it has consequences. She was right, and she refused to stop saying so. Wiltshire police built the case for Becky's murder from evidence that did not depend on the compromised confession. It took years, but in September 2016, Christopher Halliwell stood trial at Oxford Crown Court for the murder of Rebecca Godden Edwards. He pleaded not guilty. The jury heard everything. They found him guilty. He was sentenced to a whole life order, the most severe sentence in British law. No tariff, no parole review. Christopher Halliwell would die in prison. For both murders. For both women. Never to be released. For Karen Edwards, the verdict was the end of a 13-year road. Complicated grief. Hard-won justice. And the knowledge that she had never once stopped fighting, even when it felt like fighting into a wall. As for Steve Fulcher, the IPCC found misconduct. The process was lengthy and damaging. He resigned from Wiltshire Police after more than 20 years. He later wrote Catching a Serial Killer, 2017, and has stated publicly, repeatedly, that he does not regret the choice, only the system that forced him to make it. Britain has been arguing about that ever since. Christopher Halliwell drove a taxi, not a metaphor, literally, a licensed vehicle, a legitimate job. Hundreds of people climbed into his car and trusted him to take them home. He used that trust as a weapon, and he is what makes this so difficult to sit with. There was nothing to see. No warning sign on the windscreen. No alarm that should have sounded. He was a middle-aged man with a license and a sat-nav, indistinguishable from every other driver on that rank. Think about what a taxi gives you, if you intend harm. A reason to approach someone alone. A sealed, moving space that nobody looks twice at. The built-in trust of a regulated system, and the specific vulnerability of someone at the end of a night out, tired, cold, ready to be home. Defense is down. No reason to be afraid. He didn't need to hunt in the dark. He had access every single night. Halliwell murdered Becky Godden around 2003. He murdered Shauna Callahan in 2011. 8 years between the victims we know about. Were there others? Following his convictions, Wiltshire Police launched Operation Manila, a review of unsolved cases in the region, cross-referenced against Halliwell's known movements. From prison, he has offered nothing. No cooperation. No names. Operation Manila remains open. 4 families of women who vanished in Wiltshire and surrounding counties during those years without resolution. That open investigation carries a weight that does not diminish with time. The way this country responded to 2 young women, both 22, both murdered by the same man, is not a footnote to this case. It is one of its central truths. When Shauna Callahan disappeared in March 2011, the response was immediate. National. A senior detective heading the inquiry from day one. Sustained media coverage. Community searches. All of it appropriate. All of it deserved. But Becky Godden had also deserved those things. 8 years earlier. And she didn't get them. Becky struggled with addiction. She lived at the margins of the structures designed to protect people. and the record shows a disappearance was not pursued with the same urgency, not the same resources, not the same column inches. A woman is missing, and the system decides, quietly, that she is not quite missing enough. Becky Godden lay in a field in Gloucestershire for 8 years. The man who put her there drove a taxi through the same county. Karen Edwards has been asking the same question ever since. Could earlier investigation have led to Halliwell sooner? Could it have prevented what happened to Sian? It cannot be stated as fact, but it must be asked. And she deserves more than acknowledgement. She deserves change. And then there is Fulcher, a man who broke the law in order to find the truth, who bypassed a safeguard that exists for genuinely important reasons, who paid for that decision with his career. The PACE protections are not bureaucratic detail. They are the direct product of documented, systematic abuse of innocent people imprisoned because evidence was forced from them in rooms with no oversight. Those protections hold because they apply in every case, not just the convenient ones. And yet, Steve Fulcher stood on a hillside with a man he believed had taken a young woman, and he chose the human being over the procedure. His breach of those rules found Sian. It found Becky. It gave two families the answers they deserved, and it very nearly cost Becky's case its prosecution. Both things are true, simultaneously, without resolving. The Halliwell case doesn't offer a clean verdict on Fulcher. What it offers instead is a harder question. What do we do when the rules that prevent injustice also, in a specific moment, prevent justice? Who pays the cost when we follow them? Who pays the cost when we don't? That question belongs to all of us. And this case makes it impossible to look away from. Section 10. The closing. She got into a taxi at 2:52 in the morning on a cold March night in Swindon. She had had a good evening. She was ready to go home. She raised her hand. A car pulled over. She climbed in. A decision that should have been safe. Narrator beat. It wasn't. Shauna Callahan was not a cautionary tale. She was warm and funny and loved. She had a boyfriend and a career and a Saturday morning she was supposed to wake up to. She had every reason to believe the taxi was safe, because it should have been. Becky Godden was not a footnote. She was Karen Edwards' daughter and a young woman whose life had taken difficult turns she did not deserve. She lay undiscovered for 8 years. She deserved a search that didn't stop. They were taken by the same man, in the same car, in the same county, years apart. And the distance between how this country responded to them, the urgency granted to one and withheld from the other, is something we have not yet properly reckoned with. Christopher Halliwell is serving a whole life sentence. He will die in prison. He has said nothing more. Steve Fulcher lost his career and kept asking questions the system didn't want to answer. Karen Edwards never stopped fighting. She never will. Shauna Callahan, Rebecca Godden Edwards. Not victims first. People first. Say their names. Remember them whole. And the next time you get into a taxi at the end of a night out, the next time you make that ordinary, unremarkable decision, remember that Sian made it too. She trusted the wrong person. If you found this documentary important, please share it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next case. Stay safe out there.
Rather, as a result of a truly wonderful life being taken too soon. The overwhelming response and support continues to be of comfort to us and is great testament to Sian. She will continue to inspire and never be forgotten. As her mum, I want her to be remembered as the incredible person that she was. A heartfelt thank you to everyone for supporting and helping us get through this awful time. I would like to pay tribute.
We've lost a beautiful girl in the most distressing way. However, justice has been done today. It's been an arduous journey, but we've got there, and justice obviously for Sian. I would like to thank Ian, our QC, and his team